The young woman had always imagined her life unfolding in a quiet, simple way, surrounded by familiar streets and neighbors who had known her since childhood. But reality had a different plan for her. Her family struggled to make ends meet. Bills piled up, and there seemed to be no way to escape the pressure weighing down on them. At 19, she felt trapped between wanting freedom and the responsibility she carried toward her family. Every day she woke up to the same worries, the same hopelessness, and a growing fear that her life would never change. One evening, her mother approached her with a proposition that made her stomach twist. A man living far away in the mountains had expressed interest in marrying her. He had means, a stable home, and a life that seemed secure in ways they could only dream about. But she barely knew him, had never seen him, and the thought of leaving everything she had ever known terrified her. Yet her family insisted, reminding her of their struggles, the debts, and the doors that might close if she refused. It wasn't about love, not at first. It was survival. The decision weighed heavily on her. At 19, she was still learning who she was, still clinging to dreams of laughter, friends, and ordinary freedom. Yet as she sat on the edge of her small bed that night, she realized that the choice had been made for her long before she understood it. She could refuse and watch her family suffer, or she could accept and face a life she could hardly imagine. After long hours of thought and tears, she made the choice, trembling as she whispered a quiet agreement to herself. Preparing to leave her home was harder than she thought. Packing her few belongings, she felt a strange mix of excitement, fear, and regret. She held each item, remembering the memories attached to them. The worn-out notebook she had filled with dreams, the sweater her grandmother had knitted, the small photograph of her childhood friends. Each piece felt like a farewell to the life she had known, to the familiar streets, the comforting smells of home, the laughter that echoed in her memories. She wondered if she would ever see them again, if she would even recognize herself after leaving. The journey to the mountains began before sunrise. Her parents drove her to the bus station, and the car ride was quiet except for the soft rustle of tires on the road. Her father's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and her mother's eyes glistened with unshed tears. They didn't speak much. Words felt inadequate. The young woman stared out the window, watching the town shrink behind her, the streets she had known since childhood fading into the horizon. She felt the pull of uncertainty, the strange loneliness that comes with stepping into the unknown. The bus ride was long and tiring, winding through highways and roads that grew narrower and steeper. The landscape changed gradually from familiar houses to open fields, then to rolling hills and thick forests. The air grew crisper, the sky brighter, and the world around her felt both breathtaking and intimidating. She had never been this far from home, never seen such isolation. The mountains rose like silent giants, their peaks hidden in clouds, and a nervous thrill ran through her as she realized that this was where her new life would begin. As the bus climbed higher, she felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. What kind of man had she agreed to marry? Would he be kind or cruel? Would she be able to live in this remote place surrounded by trees and silence with no friends or family nearby? The questions seemed endless, and her mind replayed every warning and every hope she had clung to. She felt small in the vastness of the mountains, a tiny figure venturing into a world that was completely unknown. When the bus finally stopped at the small mountain town, she stepped off with a mixture of relief and fear. The streets were quiet, almost eerily so, lined with wooden houses and shops that looked like they had stood there for decades. The people she saw were few, their faces weathered by the sun and the wind, their movements slow but purposeful. She felt like an outsider, a stranger in a place where life moved to a rhythm she did not yet understand. Her guide for the next part of the journey was a local man who had been sent to help her reach her future home. He drove a rugged old truck, bouncing along dirt roads that cut through the forest. The young woman clutched the edge of her seat, her heart pounding as the truck swerved past trees, crossed narrow bridges, and climbed steep inclines. She had never seen anything like this, never imagined life so far removed from her own. The mountains were beautiful, wild and intimidating all at once. She could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the distant call of birds, and the occasional snap of twigs beneath unseen animals. Every sound reminded her that she was far from everything she had known. As they drove deeper into the mountains, her mind wandered to thoughts of the man she was about to marry. She had seen only a few letters and a photograph, but they offered little comfort. The letters were polite, almost formal, and the photograph showed a man with a strong, rugged face standing in front of his cabin. She did not know his voice, his mannerisms, or the way he treated others. She wondered if he had ever imagined her the way she imagined him, if he had any idea how frightened she felt. The unknown weighed heavily on her, and she struggled to find reassurance in the silent beauty of the mountains. Finally, they arrived at a clearing where a narrow path led to a cabin perched on a hillside. The cabin was sturdy, made of weathered logs with smoke curling from the chimney and a small garden that showed signs of careful tending. The young woman's heart raced as she took in her new home. It was simple, isolated and surrounded by the dense forest. She could hear the distant rush of a river and the whisper of wind through the pines. This was her life now, and the reality of it settled on her like a heavy cloak. Stepping out of the truck, she felt the cool mountain air fill her lungs. The guide helped her with her belongings, and for a moment she stood frozen, taking in the scene. The cabin, the forest, the silence, it was overwhelming. She wondered how she would adapt, how she would survive in a place so far removed from everything she had ever known. Her thoughts drifted to her family, to the friends she had left behind, to the ordinary life that seemed like a distant dream. She felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss she could not shake. When the mountain man appeared, she felt her pulse quicken. He was taller than she had expected, with broad shoulders and a presence that seemed to fill the space around him. His eyes were steady, observing her with a quiet intensity, and his expression was difficult to read. He did not smile immediately, and the young woman felt the familiar knot of fear tighten in her chest. She wondered if she had made a mistake, if she had stepped into a life she could not endure. Yet there was something in the way he stood, calm and unhurried, that suggested a man used to patience and solitude. He spoke in a deep, measured voice, introducing himself and welcoming her to his home. His words were few, but they carried a sincerity she could not ignore. He showed her around the cabin, pointing out her small room, the kitchen, and the simple furniture he had prepared for her. Everything was practical, designed for life in the mountains rather than comfort or luxury. She noticed the neatness, the order, and the care with which he had maintained the place. Despite her fear, she began to sense a strange kind of safety in his meticulousness. The first night in the cabin was difficult. She lay in the small bed, listening to the sounds of the forest, feeling the unfamiliar chill of the mountain air. Sleep came in fits and starts, and her mind was a whirlwind of questions, doubts, and what-ifs. She thought of the life she had left behind, of the familiar streets and the comforting routine, and wondered if she had made the right decision. Yet in the quiet moments, she also felt a spark of curiosity, a tiny hope that perhaps life in the mountains could offer something new, something meaningful she had not yet imagined. Over the next few days, she observed the mountain man's routines. He woke early, chopped wood, tended to the small garden, and hunted or fished for food. Everything he did was efficient and purposeful, yet there was a rhythm to it, a harmony with the land that fascinated her. She realized that life here would not be easy, but it had a clarity she had never known. Each day brought new challenges, from carrying firewood to learning the trails, but it also brought a strange satisfaction in mastering small tasks. She felt a flicker of pride in her ability to keep up, to learn, to survive in this rugged environment. Despite her growing respect for his skills, she could not shake the uncertainty that lingered. Who was this man really? Could she trust him? Would their marriage be one of mutual respect or mere survival? Each glance, each word, each gesture carried weight, and she found herself analyzing every detail. Yet in the quiet moments when the forest stretched endlessly around them, she sensed a man who was not cruel, who valued strength and resilience, and who might, just might, be capable of kindness. As the week passed, the young woman began to understand that her life had changed irreversibly. She could not return to her old world, and the mountain man's life would become hers. Fear and uncertainty still lingered, but so did a growing sense of determination. She had survived challenges before, and she would learn to survive here. She did not yet know what love, respect, or partnership might mean in this context, but she knew that her courage would be tested, and that her life would be shaped by choices she could barely imagine. The mountains loomed around her, silent and imposing, yet filled with life and possibility. She stood at the edge of the clearing, looking at the vast forest, the cabin, and the man who would now be part of her life. Her heart was heavy, Her mind filled with questions, but beneath it all there was a small, stubborn spark of hope. Life in the mountains would be hard, unpredictable, and at times lonely, but it would also be real, immediate, and filled with lessons she had never expected. The journey had just begun, and she would face it with all the strength she could muster, step by step, day by day. In those first days, she realized that fear and courage could coexist, that uncertainty was part of every new beginning, and that even in a life forced upon her, she could find a way to shape her own path. The mountains were vast, the man was enigmatic, and the future was unknown, but in that unknown, she glimpsed the first faint signs of resilience, hope, and the strange possibility of a life that could one day feel like home. The days in the mountains passed slowly at first, each one stretching longer than the one before. The young woman woke to the cold light of dawn, the air crisp and fragrant with pine and earth. She had begun to understand the rhythms of her new life, but each morning still brought a flutter of nerves. She had never lived so far from the world she knew, and the thought of being completely dependent on someone she barely knew made her anxious. She ate her simple meals quietly, observing the mountain man as he moved through the cabin with a calm, steady efficiency. He rarely spoke, yet every action seemed purposeful, as if the world itself had taught him patience and discipline. She spent the mornings helping him with small tasks around the cabin. Carrying firewood, cleaning the floors, and fetching water from the nearby stream were tiring, but they gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. At first, she moved clumsily, stumbling over roots and uneven floorboards, but he was patient. When he noticed her struggle, he would show her the right way, never with anger, only quiet guidance. There was something surprising in his manner, a firmness that demanded effort, yet a gentleness that made mistakes feel like part of learning rather than failure. She began to appreciate the small ways he cared for her, even if he never said it aloud. Afternoons were spent exploring the trails around the cabin. He insisted she learn the paths, the hidden places where wild berries grew, and the safest routes through the forest. At first she was fearful. Every rustle in the bushes made her jump. Every shadow seemed to hide danger. Yet with him by her side, she slowly began to trust. He moved with an ease she envied, stepping over roots and rocks as if the ground itself belonged to him. He pointed out tracks of animals, explained the patterns of the wind, and showed her how to read the clouds. These lessons were strange but fascinating, and she began to see the mountains not just as a place of isolation, but as a world full of life and subtle beauty. She noticed small habits that revealed who he truly was. In the evenings, he would sit by the fireplace tending to his tools, sharpening knives or mending clothes. The way he worked was meticulous, precise, almost like a ritual. She realized he respected the land, the cabin, and even her presence. He had a sense of order that she had never experienced, a discipline that made her feel both safe and humbled. It was clear he had lived a life of solitude by choice, shaped by the mountains and the demands of survival. She began to wonder if she could ever truly match his strength, his quiet resilience. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, she asked him about his life before she arrived. He hesitated, then spoke in a low voice about growing up in the mountains, learning from his father, and surviving winters that could be cruel and unforgiving. He had no desire to leave, he said, and the mountains had taught him more than any town or city ever could. She listened closely, fascinated by his stories. They were simple yet full of lessons about patience, endurance, and respect. She began to see him not just as the man she had married, but as someone deeply connected to the world around him, someone whose strength came from a life lived close to the earth. She also noticed how careful he was with her. He never forced her to do more than she could manage, and he often offered subtle guidance rather than direct orders. If she struggled to lift a heavy log, he would step in with a quiet "Here, let me help," rather than criticize. If she hesitated to try a new task, he would wait patiently, watching her until she gained the confidence to try again. She realized that this man, who had seemed intimidating and distant at first, was teaching her not only skills but self-reliance. He had a way of showing trust that made her want to rise to the challenge. The young woman also began to notice the small comforts he had prepared for her. Though the cabin was simple, there were thoughtful touches. A blanket neatly folded at the foot of her bed, a warm kettle ready in the morning, a small plate of berries he had gathered from the forest. These gestures were quiet, almost unnoticeable, but they spoke volumes. She began to understand that care did not always need words, that actions could carry more meaning than promises or declarations. She found herself slowly relaxing in his presence, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease as she learned the rhythm of this new life. Despite these small comforts, the isolation was still challenging. She missed the sound of voices, the laughter of friends, and even the simple bustle of a town. She felt the weight of loneliness in the long, quiet evenings when the fire crackled and the wind howled through the trees. She tried to distract herself with chores or by exploring the forest. But there were moments when the silence pressed in on her, making her heart ache for the familiar. She realized that adapting to this life would not be easy. That courage alone would not make the loneliness disappear. She needed to find a way to connect, to understand, and to trust. One morning he took her to a clearing high above the cabin, where the view stretched for miles. The mountains rolled endlessly, their peaks dusted with snow, and the valleys below were blanketed in green. She stood in awe, feeling a strange sense of smallness and freedom all at once. He pointed out landmarks, paths, and hidden streams, teaching her how to read the land, how to find safety and sustenance in a world that could be unforgiving. She realized that the mountains were not just obstacles, they were teachers. They demanded respect, attention, and care, but they also offered beauty, strength, and a sense of wonder she had never experienced. The mountain man's presence was steady throughout these lessons. He did not boast or seek recognition, but his confidence and knowledge were undeniable. She felt a mixture of admiration and nervousness. Could she ever live up to his expectations? Could she survive in a place where mistakes could be dangerous? Yet she also felt a growing sense of determination. She had come here unwillingly, but she was beginning to see the possibility of a life that, while hard, could be meaningful. She began to push herself, learning to climb rocks, gather firewood, and navigate the trails with more skill. Each small success brought a flicker of pride and confidence. The days were not without challenges. One afternoon she attempted to fish in the river, her hands clumsy and cold in the icy water. The mountain man watched silently, offering occasional guidance, and when she nearly fell in, he grabbed her hand, steadying her. His grip was firm but reassuring, and in that moment she realized how much she relied on him, not just for survival but for emotional grounding. She began to see him as more than a stranger, more than a figure of authority. He was becoming someone she could trust, someone whose judgment and care mattered. Evenings were the hardest when the work of the day was done and the cabin grew quiet. She would sit by the fire, her thoughts drifting to her old life, to the family she had left behind, and to the uncertainty of the future. She wondered if she had made the right choice, if she could endure this life, if she could ever feel at home here. The mountain man noticed her quiet moments and would occasionally sit beside her, offering a warm glance or a simple word of encouragement. These small gestures became anchors for her, small signs that she was not alone, that she was not entirely at the mercy of the mountains or her fears. As the week turned into 2, a subtle bond began to form between them. She learned to anticipate his routines, and he learned to notice her growing confidence. There were moments of quiet humor, her stumbling over rocks, her attempts to mimic his precise movements, but also moments of genuine connection. One evening, after a long day of gathering firewood, he handed her a cup of warm tea without speaking. She sipped it, feeling the warmth spread through her body, and realized that care did not always need words. The gesture itself carried meaning, and she began to understand that this was the way he expressed respect, trust, and perhaps even affection. She also noticed his attention to the details of survival. He showed her how to store food properly, how to prepare for sudden storms, and how to stay safe from wild animals. At first, the lessons were intimidating, the knowledge vast and overwhelming. But slowly she began to absorb it, gaining skills she never thought she could master. With each lesson, her confidence grew, and she began to see herself not just as a guest in this life, but as an active participant. She realized that while the mountains demanded strength and resilience, they also offered the chance to grow, to learn, and to find a sense of accomplishment that she had never known in her old life. One evening, she watched him work by the fire, sharpening his tools with careful precision. She saw the concentration in his eyes, the patience in his hands, and something shifted inside her. She realized that this man, who had seemed so distant and unapproachable, had a depth she had never anticipated. He was shaped by the mountains, by solitude, by a life that demanded more than most could endure, yet he carried it all with quiet dignity. She began to feel a strange admiration, a respect that mingled with her fear. creating a complex web of emotions she was only beginning to understand. As part 2 drew to a close, the young woman understood that the mountains were no longer just a backdrop for her life. They were an active force, shaping her thoughts, actions, and emotions. She had faced fear, uncertainty, and the challenge of adapting to a life far removed from anything she had known. And in the mountain man, she had begun to see a figure who was not only her husband in name but a guide, a teacher, and a steady presence in a world that could be unpredictable and harsh. She did not yet know what the future held, but she had begun to find her footing, to see the first signs of resilience, and to understand that even in this remote, challenging life she could grow, learn, and survive. The days leading up to the wedding felt heavier than any she had experienced since arriving in the mountains. The young woman woke each morning with a mixture of dread and curiosity, unsure of what the day would bring. She had come to know the mountain man in ways small and subtle, his habits, his quiet gestures, his careful ways of teaching her the mountain life. But the thought of formally uniting their lives in front of others brought a new tension. She had imagined weddings differently, full of laughter, music, and celebration, but here it would be simple, raw, and intimate, set against the backdrop of the towering mountains. Her mind was a swirl of questions and anxieties. Would he speak kind words? Would he look at her the way she had begun to hope he might? Or would it be as silent and distant as so many of the days they had shared? She could not remember ever feeling so exposed, not physically but emotionally. Every glance, every movement carried weight now, and she felt both excitement and fear. For nights she had lain awake, staring at the wooden ceiling of her small room, imagining the ceremony, rehearsing the vows in her mind, and wondering how a man who had been so silent could show any hint of tenderness in this public moment. On the morning of the wedding, the air was crisp and clear, the sun spilling gold across the peaks. The mountains seemed to shine with a strange intensity, as if aware that something momentous was about to happen. The young woman dressed in the simple outfit she had prepared, a plain but clean dress, her hair loosely braided to keep it neat, and stared at her reflection in the small mirror. She barely recognized herself. The girl who had left her hometown was still inside her, but she had begun to change, shaped by the mountains, by work, by fear, and by small moments of connection with the man she was to marry. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her braid, a mixture of anticipation and nervousness coursing through her. When she stepped outside, the mountain man was already waiting, his rugged form silhouetted against the morning sun. He wore simple clothing, nothing like the suits or ties she had imagined in wedding pictures, but his presence was commanding. He looked at her carefully, almost studying her, and for a moment she thought he might not speak at all. The silence stretched, the mountains echoing only the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. And then, in the calmest voice she had ever heard from him, he said her name. It was not loud or dramatic, but it carried attention, recognition, and something else she could not name. Her heart fluttered, and she realized that in his silence there was focus. In his stillness there was intention. The ceremony was held in a small clearing near the edge of the forest. A few locals had been invited, people who respected him, knew him, and understood the ways of the mountains. They stood quietly, observing the couple, their expressions curious but respectful. The young woman felt exposed in a way she had not expected. All eyes were on her. Yet the presence of the mountains and the trees around her lent a strange comfort. It was as if the world had shrunk, leaving only what was essential, her, him, and the life they were about to step into together. As the officiant began to speak, she felt a tightness in her chest. She expected the ceremony to be formal, perhaps cold. But as the words were spoken, she sensed a shift. She looked at him, expecting the same impassive expression she had grown used to, and instead she saw a flicker of something unfamiliar, intensity perhaps, or care. She realized then that this man, who had seemed so distant, carried his own way of honoring the moment. It was not in flowery words or gestures, but in the weight he gave to his presence, in the steadiness of his gaze, and in the subtle way he moved to make her feel secure. When it was time for vows, she felt her throat tighten. She had written none, assuming he would speak the few words necessary to make the union official, but then he did something that shocked everyone present. He knelt before her, not as a gesture of submission, but as a gesture of intention, respect, and recognition. He spoke slowly, clearly, not from a script or expectation, but from a place of honesty. He promised care, partnership, and a life shared not as master and servant, but as equals facing the challenges and beauty of the mountains together. His voice was steady, his eyes unwavering, and for the first time she saw the warmth that had been hidden beneath his rugged exterior. The crowd was silent, stunned by the unexpected gesture. Locals exchanged glances, murmuring softly to one another. They had known him for years, respected him as a solitary and stern man, but this act revealed a depth few had ever witnessed. The young woman felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by a mixture of relief, surprise, and gratitude. Here was a man she had feared, a man whose presence had been intimidating and inscrutable, revealing suddenly that beneath the ruggedness was a capacity for thoughtfulness and care she had not imagined. As he stood again, he extended his hand and she took it, feeling a warmth that went beyond touch. She realized that the mountains, the isolation, the hardships they had faced together so far had prepared them for this moment. The ceremony continued, simple and brief, but now infused with a sense of sincerity and connection that words alone could not convey. Every glance, every gesture spoke of a bond that had begun to form in the quiet days before. A bond built not on fantasy but on trust, endurance, and shared experience. After the ceremony, they stayed in the clearing for a while, taking in the view. The mountains stretched endlessly, bathed in sunlight, and the wind carried the scent of pine and earth. She felt a strange sense of freedom, as if the mountains themselves were bearing witness to the start of their life together. He remained by her side, not as a distant figure, but as someone who had chosen to honor her presence, her courage, and her willingness to step into a world unknown. She realized that this moment, simple as it was, marked a turning point, not just in their lives, but in the way she understood trust, respect, and partnership. The young woman could not stop replaying the moment in her mind. The kneeling, the vows, the unexpected sincerity. It was more than she had hoped for, yet entirely in line with the man she had come to know. He did not wear his heart on his sleeve, did not seek praise or admiration, but in that quiet act he revealed a depth that left her both humbled and hopeful. She began to see that the life she had dreaded might contain moments of genuine connection, moments that would grow stronger over time, shaping both of them in ways neither could predict. In the days that followed, the young woman found herself reflecting often on the wedding. The shock of his gesture remained with her, a touchstone she could return to when fear or uncertainty crept in. It reminded her that this man, despite his solitude and stern reputation, was capable of intentional care. She began to look at him differently, not just as a figure of authority or survival, but as someone who could be a partner, a guide, and perhaps a companion in ways she had never expected. Life in the mountains resumed its rhythm, but the wedding had shifted something fundamental. The young woman felt a growing sense of belonging, not because the mountains were easy or because her fears had disappeared, but because she had witnessed a capacity for care and respect that gave her hope. The mountain man's actions had communicated more than words could. They had shown her that even in a world so removed from her old life, connection and partnership were possible. She began to notice more of the subtle ways he supported her. When she struggled with the cold, he would prepare an extra blanket. When she fumbled with tools, he guided her patiently. Even in silence, he communicated attention and respect. She realized that love in this place was not expressed in grand gestures or romantic words, but in consistent, thoughtful actions, in the quiet attention to her needs, and in the shared work that defined their life together. The young woman also began to see herself differently. She was no longer just a frightened girl forced into an unknown life. She was learning, adapting, and finding strength in unexpected ways. The wedding had been a turning point, not because it changed the mountains or the isolation, but because it shifted the relationship between her and the mountain man. They had taken a step together, one of trust and recognition, and it had opened the door to a deeper understanding of what life could be, even in this rugged and remote place. The days following the wedding were filled with tasks and routines, but they carried a new meaning. Every chore, every lesson, every shared moment became part of a larger tapestry, one woven with care, effort, and slowly growing affection. She learned to chop wood efficiently, to navigate the trails, to anticipate the changing weather, and to find small joys in the simple beauty of the mountains. And with each lesson she began to see that the man she had married was not just a figure of stern authority, but someone who valued resilience, honesty, and quiet connection. Evenings were no longer quite so lonely. She would sit by the fire and he would join her without speaking, simply sharing the warmth and presence that had become comforting. They did not need words to understand each other. Their actions, their rhythms, and their attention were enough. She felt a growing sense of peace, a recognition that even in a life she had not chosen freely, she could find meaning, trust, and eventually, a sense of belonging. The wedding had been more than a ceremony. It had been a revelation. It had shown her that even a man who appeared distant and unapproachable could express care and respect in ways that mattered deeply. It had shown her that partnership was not about grand gestures or endless declarations, but about consistent attention, shared effort, and the courage to honor another person's presence. And it had shown her that she too was capable of rising to the challenge, of finding strength and resilience she had never known she possessed. As the sun set over the mountains, casting long shadows and painting the peaks in gold and pink, the young woman felt a sense of quiet wonder. She was no longer simply a girl brought to the mountains by circumstance. She was part of a new life, one that demanded courage, patience, and trust. She had faced fear and uncertainty, and in doing so, she had discovered the first hints of a bond that might endure, a connection that had begun in silence but spoke louder than words ever could. Life after the wedding settled into a rhythm, though it was far from easy. The mountains were beautiful, but they were unforgiving, and every day brought challenges that tested both the young woman and the mountain man. She woke with the sun, the cold air biting her skin as she moved to start her daily tasks. Chopping wood, carrying water, tending the small garden, and preparing food all required strength and patience. She was no longer the hesitant girl who had arrived weeks earlier. The mountains were slowly shaping her, forcing her to adapt, to learn, and to trust in herself as well as in him. The mountain man continued his steady routines, and she began to understand the quiet rhythm of his life. He rose early, moved with purpose, and expected her to keep pace but never demanded more than she could handle. When she struggled, he offered guidance with patience rather than criticism. If she failed at a task, he did not scold her. Instead, he showed her the correct way and allowed her to try again. This consistent care built a new kind of trust between them. She realized that his stern reputation had never meant cruelty, only a respect for the work and the land that demanded seriousness. Over time, she learned to anticipate his actions. She observed how he prepared tools, checked traps, and measured food supplies. She began to see patterns in his movements and routines, learning not just how to survive, but how to live with purpose in a place that could be harsh and isolating. Each lesson strengthened her confidence, though she still felt the occasional pang of doubt, wondering if she was truly capable of thriving in this environment. He noticed her hesitation but never pushed her beyond her limits, allowing her to grow at her own pace. One morning, a heavy frost had covered the garden, threatening the crops that were just beginning to grow. She worried about the food supply and felt overwhelmed by the responsibility. The mountain man noticed her distress and calmly explained how to protect the plants, showing her how to carefully cover them and insulate the soil. As she worked alongside him, she felt a sense of accomplishment, the fear and anxiety replaced by quiet pride. It was a small victory, but it meant more to her than she could have imagined. She realized that life in the mountains was not just about survival. It was about learning, adapting, and discovering inner strength. The harshness of mountain life also taught her resilience in unexpected ways. One afternoon, a sudden storm rolled in, the sky dark and heavy with clouds. The wind whipped through the trees and rain began to fall in sheets. She had never experienced weather like this, and panic briefly set in. But he remained calm, guiding her to secure the cabin, cover firewood, and ensure their food supplies would not be ruined. She followed his lead, moving quickly and efficiently. And as they worked together, she felt a growing confidence in her ability to face challenges. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, they worked side by side, a team shaped by circumstance and necessity. Evenings were quieter, filled with small moments that deepened their bond. They would sit together by the fire, preparing food or repairing clothing. She began to notice the subtle ways he cared for her, leaving her favorite cup of tea by the fire, ensuring her blanket was warm, or silently adjusting the bed to make her comfortable. These gestures were small, but they carried meaning, and she found herself appreciating the thoughtfulness that had once gone unnoticed. The mountain man rarely spoke of feelings, yet she understood that care could be expressed in actions as clearly as in words. She also began to notice her own growth. Tasks that had once seemed impossible now felt manageable. She could chop wood, tend the garden, and navigate the trails with confidence. The physical strength she gained was matched by emotional resilience. She no longer feared the isolation or the hardships of mountain life. Instead, she began to embrace them as part of a journey that was teaching her perseverance, patience, and self-reliance. The fear that had accompanied her since leaving home began to transform into determination and quiet pride. Despite the progress she had made, moments of doubt and loneliness still arrived. The long, quiet evenings sometimes felt heavy, and she missed the presence of her family and the simplicity of her old life. She would sit by the fire, staring into the flames, and feel the weight of isolation pressing down. But the mountain man's presence, steady and calm, offered reassurance. He did not speak much, but when he did, his words carried a weight and clarity that grounded her. She began to understand that connection did not always need constant conversation. Trust, support, and shared effort were enough to bridge the silence. The young woman also started noticing the subtle ways he taught her about the land. He showed her how to identify edible plants, how to track animals, and how to prepare for changing seasons. These lessons were not given in a rush or with impatience. He allowed her to observe, try, fail, and succeed. She began to see the world through his eyes, appreciating the quiet beauty of the mountains and the delicate balance required to live in harmony with them. Each day brought new knowledge, new challenges, and new confidence. She realized that she was not merely surviving, she was learning to thrive. As weeks passed, a deeper understanding began to form between them. The mountain man's actions revealed his respect not only for the land but for her as well. He valued her presence, her efforts, and her growth. When she accomplished a difficult task, he acknowledged it with a quiet nod or a rare smile, and the recognition meant more than words could express. She began to feel that she was not alone in this life, that they were partners in a shared journey, facing challenges together rather than separately. This realization brought a sense of comfort and belonging that she had not expected. One evening, while gathering firewood, she stumbled on a hidden root and fell, scraping her hand. The pain was sharp and she winced, expecting him to react harshly or show frustration. Instead, he rushed to her side, examining the cut carefully and cleaning it with water from a nearby stream. He wrapped it with a piece of cloth, speaking softly to ensure she was not frightened. She was struck by the contrast between the rugged, imposing figure she had first met and the careful, considerate actions he displayed in moments like this. It became clear that his strength was not only physical, but also emotional, expressed through quiet care and attention. As the young woman adjusted to this life, she began to see the small joys hidden within the hardships. The mornings when the sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the peaks, were breathtaking. The scent of pine and fresh water, the sound of bird song, and the feeling of wind on her face brought moments of peace and wonder. She discovered satisfaction in completing tasks, pride in learning new skills, and comfort in the steady presence of the mountain man. Life was not easy, but it was honest, immediate, and deeply rewarding in ways she had never known. She also began to understand the importance of patience and observation. The mountain man rarely rushed her, allowed her to learn at her own pace, and demonstrated the value of careful attention. He showed her how to notice changes in the weather, the movements of animals, and the subtle signs of danger. She learned to read the land, anticipate challenges, and respond with confidence. Each lesson strengthened her connection to the mountains and to him, creating a sense of partnership that went beyond words. Over time, they developed unspoken routines. She would prepare the fire while he checked the traps. He would bring fresh water while she gathered vegetables. These simple acts, repeated day after day, created a rhythm and a sense of cooperation. They learned to anticipate each other's needs, to work together seamlessly, and to rely on one another in ways that fostered trust and respect. She realized that the life she had dreaded was slowly becoming familiar, and she was beginning to feel a sense of competence and independence she had never experienced before. Even the harsh winters, which had initially terrified her, became manageable through preparation and shared effort. She learned to store food, insulate the cabin, and maintain warmth. The mountain man's knowledge and skills were invaluable, but he also encouraged her to participate, to take responsibility, and to gain confidence in her own abilities. She found that facing these challenges together brought them closer, fostering a bond that was built not on convenience or comfort, but on mutual effort, respect, and resilience. In quiet moments, she reflected on how much she had grown. The girl who had arrived frightened, unsure, and overwhelmed was now capable of handling tasks that once seemed impossible. She had learned to trust herself, to trust him, and to find meaning in the simplicity and demands of mountain life. Each day brought lessons, challenges, and small victories, shaping her into someone stronger, more confident, and more self-reliant. She began to see the value in the life she had once feared, recognizing that hardship could teach resilience, patience, and connection in ways comfort never could. The young woman also noticed the way the mountain man changed subtly in her presence. He was less rigid, more patient, and more willing to share his knowledge and routines. She realized that their partnership was influencing him as much as it was shaping her. Together, they were creating a life defined by cooperation, trust, and shared effort. The mountains had tested them both, but they were learning to navigate the challenges together, growing stronger individually and as a pair. As Part 4 drew to a close, she understood that life in the mountains was not about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was about consistency, trust, and quiet care. She had begun to see the mountain man not just as a figure of authority but as a partner, a guide, and a steady presence in a world that could be unpredictable and harsh. She realized that love and respect could emerge in small, consistent actions, and that a life built on shared effort and understanding could be rich, meaningful, and deeply fulfilling. She no longer feared the mountains, the isolation, or the unknown. She had faced them, learned from them, and found strength she had never known existed. The mountain man's presence, steady and reliable, had become a source of comfort, trust, and inspiration. Together, they had begun to carve out a life that was not just about survival, but about growth, connection, and the possibility of a future built on resilience, care, and mutual respect.